Now you can start.
Okay. We are ready to start. Welcome to El Centro. My name is Veronica Montes. I use here her pronouns. I am the director for El Centro. El Centro is this space, the Hispanic and Latinx cultural show. I am so happy to have you all here and online for this event that is part of our Heritage Month. We celebrate Hispanic and Latinx Heritage Month from October 15th. Sorry, from September 15th to October 15th. I really want that ends. And we do a lot of events. You can find more of our events in our Instagram website, or just follow us sign in for our newsletter. And I think, Nina, do you want to introduce our guest speaker for today?
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Nina Ha. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the APIDA Plus Center, and I am really excited to have our featured guest speaker today, Dr. Diego Javier Luis, who is the Rohrbaugh Assistant Professor in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins University. He specializes in colonial Latin American and Spanish Pacific history. He is the author of The First Asians in the Americas, a Trans-Pacific History, which Harvard University Press published this year. So I will give it to you.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction, Nina. I also want to give an extra thanks to both you and to Veronica and El Centro for the invitation and for hosting. It's a real honor to be before you all today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see. Okay. Okay. So just give me a thumbs up if everyone's seeing this. Okay, great. So this is the First Asians in the Americas. As I often do, I'd like to begin by throwing us all into the deep end with a story that will take us to a time and place that perhaps a few of us here may be familiar with. And if that sounds a bit foreboding, not to worry, I'll pull us back out in just a few minutes. So let's jump straight in. Okay. The year was 1693, and our site is the city of Durango on the northern Mexican frontier, which you can see represented on this map in the northeastern corner. That year, a man named Alonso Coronel made a rather perplexing decision to denounce himself to the Inquisition for bigamy, that is to say, for the sin of having married twice. Bigamy was, of course, a violation of the Catholic sacrament of marriage. Therefore, the Inquisition, which was an institution that policed the bounds of what was considered acceptable Catholic practice, prosecuted the case. Coronel was 72 years old and described himself as a quote-unquote indio born in Lima, the colonial capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru, one of two Spanish kingdoms in the Americas at the time. By calling himself an indio, he identified himself as an indigenous subject of the Spanish crown. The word indio literally translates to Indian and dates to Columbus's head-spinning confusion about the destination of his voyage west across the Atlantic in 1492. In the Caribbean, he believed that he had found the route to Asia across the Atlantic and not, in fact, a quote-unquote new world. Hence, the inhabitants of the Caribbean were South Asian Indians to Columbus, and not, in fact, indigenous Taínos, Arawaks, and other groups. The name soon extended throughout the hemisphere and even returned to Asia on the lips of Spaniards crossing the Pacific. During the Inquisition trial, we learned that, as a free indio, Coronel had traveled all over the Hispanic world, including to Spain, and then back across the Atlantic to Mexico. On Mexico's Pacific coast, he had married an enslaved woman laboring on a cacao plantation described as a mulata or mixed black woman. Her name was Leonor de Hinojosa. Together they had a son, Jose, and a daughter, Maria, born into enslavement because captivity was inherited through the mother. After 9 years of marriage, Leonor fell sick, and Coronel then abandoned the family, but not before snatching over 100 pesos from Leonor's enslaver on the way out. Coronel then wandered north and found his way to Durango, where he married again, this time to a woman described as white and with an indigenous grandparent. By interviewing a series of witnesses, the inquisitors discovered that Leonor and her son Jose had died of the illness several years prior, and Coronel was permitted to remarry. Now, even though all of this information came out during an Inquisition trial, it is actually not a terribly uncommon story for colonial Latin America. Spanish subjects, indigenous people included, often roamed the colonial world, inventing identities for themselves and even marrying in multiple places when they decided to settle down. However, there was something different about Coronel. In the words of one witness, Coronel had, quote, the skin color and eyes that those who are called chinos in Mexico City usually have, end quote. While chino literally means Chinese in Spanish, in colonial Mexico, it could refer to any Asian in the broadest sense. Since all of Asia was frequently referred to as La China in Mexico, people who came from La China became monolithic chinos. Another witness also expressed doubt that Coronel was an Indio by saying that he was a, quote, seemingly Chino native that says he is from the city of Lima, end quote. Coronel admitted that his parents were from the Kapampangan ethno-linguistic group in the Philippines and that they had crossed the Pacific and migrated to Mexico, and that they had subsequently moved to Lima, where he was born in the early 1620s. And of course, the implication here is that a Chino could not be someone who was native to the Americas, but had to be someone who came from overseas, right? As a second-generation migrant born in Peru, Coronel had taken to calling himself indigenous or Indio rather than the label that would have applied to his parents, which was Chino. However, Coronel's physical appearance made him a Chino in the eyes of colonial officials, which linked his story to those of thousands of others, free and enslaved, who disembarked the trans-Pacific galleons in Mexico during the early modern period. They were the first Asians in the Americas, and they are the focus of my recently published book, which goes by the same name, The First Asians in the Americas. They came from Gujarat in South Asia to the west, Nagasaki to the east, and everywhere between. Though most were from the Philippine archipelago and the Bay of Bengal. And this is largely because of the fact of Spanish colonial presence in the Philippines, as well as the frequency of Portuguese slave raids and slave trading in South Asia. However, there are many cases of smaller concentrations of people from elsewhere, like the so-called Spice Islands of Ternate and Tidore in what is now Indonesia, like Macau in southeastern China, and like the Korean Peninsula. The ships that carried these people across the Pacific are called the Manila Galleons, and they operated for 250 years from 1565 until the Wars of Independence in Mexico in 1815. They would depart the port of Cavite in the Philippines, just south of the colonial capital of Manila in the northernmost large island in the Philippines called Luzon. And they would land in Acapulco, Mexico, on the Pacific coast after 5 to 6 months at sea. And in this map here, you can see actually in this dotted line across the Pacific, the galleon route that connected the Philippines to Mexico for 250 years during the early modern period. The seafaring conditions on these galleons were simply horrific. Sailors and the enslaved had to live and sleep on deck and under the stars because the ship holds were filled with Chinese trade goods like silk, porcelain, and lacquer. So in other words, there was no room for the predominantly Asian sailors and the enslaved to be below decks in the case of the Manila galleons. These galleons also passed through the frigid and turbulent waters of the North Pacific, where winter-like conditions and storms were all too common. Having departed from a tropical climate and having entered one so frigid and hostile, many succumbed to the elements, to say nothing of frequent shortages of provisions and the contraction of diseases like scurvy and beriberi. Nonetheless, these galleons and the global mobility of people they facilitated made colonial Mexico a truly global hub. It was the center of not only the Atlantic world, connected to Western Europe and Western and West Central Africa, but it was also the center of the Pacific world and closely linked to Asia. And again, we have a good representation in this map of colonial Mexico being linked by trade routes to both the Atlantic and the Pacific worlds, and hemispherically as well. In my book, I argue that the invention of the Chino label was the first time in the history of the Americas that any person perceived as Asian could be referred to with a single word. As such, Chino masked the enormous diversity of people who disembarked the galleons in Acapulco. Because of the monolithic nature of this label, Chinos occupied a range of social statuses that we might consider paradoxical today. They could be free or enslaved, considered white or black, or any gradation between. They could be poor laborers or members of the lower elite who themselves owned slaves. They could be Asian, they could be mixed, they could be Catholic, Muslim, or hold other spiritual beliefs entirely. The only commonality that all Chinos shared is the constructed nature of their colonial trans-Pacific identifications. And because of that, they had become, I argue, a new kind of malleable and globally mobile subject in world history. But as fascinating as I think the early modern period is, that isn't the only thing I came to talk to you about today. With this talk, I also want to explore some of the present day ramifications of this history, this early modern history, and of stories like that of Alonso Coronel. And my ultimate aspiration is to convince you that Asian American history, to a certain extent, begins in Latin America. Of course, the category of Asian America is a relatively recent invention. Like many terms with the word America or American in it, it often refers exclusively to this country, such that the term might more accurately be rendered as Asian US. However, as people from Tijuana and all the way down to Tierra del Fuego at the bottom of South America are constantly reminding us, America is not a single country, it is a hemisphere. If we accept this basic premise to be true, then Asian America must include Latin America and the Caribbean. And if we accept this new orientation, then we must subsequently accept the fact that Asians have been in the Americas for far longer than they have been in the US. Indeed, for over 2 centuries before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. For me, the power of studying the histories of the so-called Chinos of the early modern period is to disrupt the familiarity and perhaps misleading comfort of disciplines in the way they train us to think, that of Asian American studies included. This is not a history with the familiar beats of the Transcontinental Railroad and Chinese exclusion during the 19th century and of Japanese American incarceration during World War II. This is a history of global enslavement, of surviving 6 months at sea with no opportunity to take on supplies, of arriving at a colonial society undergoing many rapid and destructive transformations, and of finding a way to integrate into the strange new world. I would be remiss, however, if I did not mention that some Asian Americanists have recognized that Asian American history cannot be told without Latin America and the Caribbean. For example, in At America's Gates, Erica Lee demonstrates that after the Chinese Exclusion Act banned Chinese entry into the US in 1882, many Chinese migrants chose to go first to Mexico and then cross the border at places that may sound familiar from today's news cycles, like El Paso and Laredo. Lee argues persuasively that the Chinese were the first quote-unquote illegal, or I would say illegalized, immigrants in the US, and that controlling their entry from Mexico and also from Cuba, which similarly had a large Chinese population during the 19th century, and that's connected to my own family history, provided the initial impetus to militarize US borders and to create an infrastructure designed to police and criminalize immigrants of specific nationalities. And of course, we're still vividly living these violent legacies today. And as many of you, I'm sure, noticed, the discourse around immigration at last night's vice presidential debate is a clear example. In a similar vein, consider another of the canonical moments of Asian American history, Japanese American incarceration, in which 120,000 people, most of whom were US citizens, were locked up in camps all over the country and their property expropriated because US politicians thought they might sabotage the US war effort against Japan. However, this movement to incarcerate Japanese immigrants and their descendants extended throughout the hemisphere. Japanese Latin Americans from 13 countries were deported from their home countries in Latin America in the thousands and sent to Crystal City, Texas for the duration of the war. Some, like the Japanese Peruvian Seiichi Higashire, remained in the US afterwards and joined the redress and reparations movement that found some success in the 1980s. Higashida wrote a memoir of those harrowing years called Adios to Tears. And people like him should deeply complicate our notion of who Asian Americans are and the transnational scope of their lives. In my view, the early modern period speaks even more profoundly to the foundational myths of the historical canon. As the ambulatory life of Alonso Coronel so aptly demonstrates, Asians and Asian descendants had already spread throughout the hemisphere during the early modern period, including even to the land that would one day become the US. As the Manila galleons sailed towards the Americas from the Philippines, they would continue eastward across the North Pacific until spotting Cape Mendocino in California, represented as this very northern node on this map of California here, before turning south for Mexico. As it stood, the galleons were not permitted to stop in California on their journey south because the coast was considered too rocky and uncharted to risk the valuable cargo of precious Asian wares for something so basic as food and fresh water. Who needs that anyway? So in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Spaniards launched several voyages of exploration to what is now the West Coast in search of possible safe harbors for the galleons. One of the most important of these voyages departed from the Portuguese enclave of Macau under the command of Pedro de Unamuno, which reached the West Coast in 1587. In addition to scouting for deep water ports, Unamuno also searched, unsuccessfully I might add, for mythical islands of gold and silver in the Pacific. The expedition landed at a site now known as Morro Bay in California. Disembarking with a company of Spaniards were 8 men from the island of Luzon in the Philippines. They are the first documented people of Asian origin to land in what would become the US during the early modern period. They served as auxiliaries and quote-unquote spies in the landing party under the very questionable logic that indigenous people from one land would be effective intermediaries with indigenous people from another. As you might imagine, the strategy did not work. The native inhabitants of Morro Bay, likely Salinan or Northern Chumash people, frustrated the landing party at every turn. They retreated inland and left only abandoned villages and smoldering fires. The 8 Philippine guides climbed to the high ground in search of a way to contact these elusive people, but eventually they gave up and returned to the beach and directly into an ambush. 3 Spaniards suffered grave wounds, and 1 without armor was skewered through the chest with a spear and died. One of the Philippine auxiliaries rushed to protect the wounded with a shield and fell during the fighting as well. The rest managed to escape. This inauspicious beginning would not be the last time that Asian auxiliaries and sailors on Spanish ships would find their way to the West Coast either. In 1602, a Spanish captain named Sebastián Vizcaíno departed the port of Acapulco on an expedition to locate a mythical strait called Añan that was said to connect the Americas to Asia, and which we can also see represented on this map, this kind of northern landmass and a mythical strait that connects the Americas to Asia. So in a notarial record containing a list of the crew members, I found that 7 of them on this expedition were Asian. Anton Tomas was from Malabar in India, and he was a specialist, a diver. Antonio Bengala from the Bay of Bengal and Francisco Miguel from Japan were low-ranking sailors known as grumetes, or cabin boys. Cristobal Catoya, Agustin Longalo, Lucas Cate, and Agustin Sao also worked as grumetes and were likely from the Philippines. Catoya was also a skilled carpenter. They were all in Acapulco, likely convalescing and working odd jobs at the port alongside other Asian sailors, before embarking on another galleon back across the Pacific during the next sailing season. However, for them, Vizcaíno's expedition was a better option because riskier voyages of exploration paid significantly better than sailing on a regular trade route. The Vizcaíno voyage represents the first documented European contact with what is now Oregon. At Cape Mendocino in California, a storm blew 2 of Vizcaíno's vessels 150 miles north into southern Oregon. On January 20th, 1603, Vizcaíno spotted Cape Sebastian, or Cape Sebastian as it's commonly called. He believed that the mouth of today's Rogue River was the entrance to the mythical Strait of Anyan. He wrote that the cliffs and mountains that came right up to the coast and were covered in snow, and that he and his men were too weak with hunger to land and contact the native people they saw by the river. The research I did on this voyage later became a song called 1603, written and performed by Asian American musician Nono Boy, who I believe recently played a concert at Virginia Tech not too long ago. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to give 1603 a listen. The Asian presence in these Spanish voyages to the West Coast should unsettle much of our national mythology. This all happened well before the founding of Jamestown in 1607, which of course was the first permanent English settlement in North America. But what greater argument is there than that of historical evidence to shoot down any racist caricature of Asian people as somehow foreign to the Americas? The Manila Galleons teach us that Asians had been coming and going from the hemisphere as long as any European people and have just as much an ancestral claim of belonging to the Americas as anyone who is not indigenous. These arguments have acquired all the more urgency in the post-COVID moment as the groundbreaking data from StopAAPIHate.org makes clear the scope and intensity of anti-Asian nativism in this country, a pattern repeated in Latin America as well. The early modern period similarly complicates any simple notion of who Latin Americans are. They are not only the mythical mestizos endlessly mixed among the three nodes of European, indigenous, and African ancestry. Some 20,000 free and enslaved Asian people made the Pacific crossing on the galleons. By the end of the colonial period in Mexico, they and their descendants numbered several times that number. And during the 19th century, new cycles of forced labor brought 500,000 South Asians to the Circum-Caribbean and more than 250,000 Chinese people to Cuba, Peru, and elsewhere. The demographic impact of Asian migratory circuits to the Americas had profound social and cultural repercussions that have been silenced for far too long and that are very eloquently represented in this art performance by Chinese Afro-Cuban artist Maria Magdalena Campos Pons. I would like to go a step further, though. The political project of Asian America is, of course, not merely about searching for any mention of Asian people in archives and then pontificating on what that means for the 21st century. During the late 1960s, it began as an expression of pan-ethnic solidarity against what Daryl Maida calls, quote, the twin chains of Babylon, racism and imperialism, end quote. It was a movement advocating for civil rights, for worldwide decolonization, and for radical revisions to college curricula to teach histories often left out of the historical canon that were personally relevant to the increasingly diverse demographics of collegegoers. In the conclusion of my book, I argue that the ways in which Chinos made space for themselves in the colonial world speak to the political sensibilities of the Asian American movement. Although there's not enough time to fully elaborate here, and perhaps we can get into this in the Q&A if there's interest, people called Chinos in colonial Mexico often found new ways of expressing social, intimate, and intellectual connections with each other and other groups in the Americas. For example, enslaved Chinos learned numerous tactics that indigenous and Afro-diasporic people had developed to contest their bondage, to challenge the authority of their enslavers, and sometimes to resist enslavement outright. They ran away together, denounced the Catholic faith at strategic moments, and developed other spiritual beliefs that endowed them with authority beyond the Catholic purview. I often call these moments of intersection micro-alliances that operated against the grain of colonial power and that in nearly every case formed across multiple ethno-linguistic groups. In addition, most enslaved Chinos married Afro-Mexicans, not unlike Coronel, who we began with. And as such, the early modern period is also the beginning of Afro-Asian history in the hemisphere, which I prefer to better characterize as Afro-Asian indigenous history. Their worlds were the clearest expression of the meeting of the Atlantic and Pacific diasporic trajectories in the Americas. As an intellectual genealogy, there's a strong case for beginning an historical investigation into the political project of Asian America in the textile mills of colonial Mexico, its plantations, warehouses, households, mines, and bake shops, everywhere enslaved people lived, labored, and gathered. However, as much as I believe in establishing a new origin for our narration of Asian American history and its relationship to Latin American history, creative writers coming out of both traditions have often reminded us that trying to find the first is not the final objective. As Thi Bui so eloquently demonstrates in her graphic novel, The Best We Could Do, diasporic origins are ephemeral. They dissolve at the touch because returning to the origin supplies no truly therapeutic remedy for the trauma of displacement or of being in between places. In the words of Nuyorican poet Tato Laviera, being ni de aquí ni de allá, being from neither here nor there. In Bui's case, the country she and her family fled from no longer exists. There is no return. Instead, it is the act of searching, but not of finding, that can provide healing. Similarly, in the words of Catherine Senisa Choi, quote, "There is no singular Asian American origin story that begins in one time and one place, and then progresses linear like thread. Rather, like a galaxy of stars, the multiple origins of Asian American history are distinctive, but most meaningful when collectively visible as a constellation, revealing intricate connections that present new ways of seeing, understanding, and moving forward." Let then the 16th century serve as yet another origin that moves us toward the disintegration of categories, or at least the disintegration of the old way of understanding categories like Asian American and Latin American as discrete and not, in fact, as deeply interconnected. Not only do stories like that of Alonso Coronel force us to grapple with multi-ethnic encounters that exceeded the fragile boundaries of colonial racial thought, but they also force us to question the categories and hierarchies at the center of archival knowledge production. These are histories of how people, about whom we know very little and many of whom were enslaved, connected the world and created new ways of being in global colonial societies. It is these unexpected yet necessary stories that populate my book and that disrupt and reconstruct the meta-narratives of forced labor, multi-ethnic convergence, race thinking, and global colonialism that no less than define both the Latin American and Asian American historical processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. It's a lot to digest as well. Let's see, before I ask questions, anyone in the audience have questions? For
You hear me?
yes.
Yes.
So I have a question about
Okay, now I was not able to hear. Sorry, there was a bit of echoing.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So about the factors that brought Asians from Asia to Central and South America, especially post-independence, because from what I understand about U.S. Asian American history, it was just the immense wealth of the
Matt,
US.
can you speak up or come closer, please? It's harder to hear you.
So yeah, from what I understand, it was the immense wealth of the United States that brought a bunch of Chinese and Indians and drew them to, make this kind of half globe journey over here. And I'm wondering if there are similar factors that drew them to places like Brazil, which is the second largest Japanese population outside of Japan, I think, and just to that part of the world in general. Like, was there an expectation of wealth post-independence or something else?
All right, so that's a good question. So what I can speak to is what's going on in the early modern context and some of the reverberations I see later on of some of those trends. So I mean, the dominant mode through which Asians arrived in the Americas during the Gallian period is through two means. One is enslavement. So basically, we oftentimes think of early modern enslavement as being solely the transatlantic slave trade, but enslavement was a global phenomenon. Portuguese enslavers, as I mentioned, were very active in the circum-Indian Ocean world. Macau, Nagasaki, these were all important slave trading hubs, and Manila was an extension of that. So some of the trans-Pacific slave trading that we see through the galleons is an extension of regional slave trading networks in Southeast Asia. So beyond that, you also have most of the labor on the galleons being performed by Asian sailors as well, the majority of whom are from the Philippines. During this period, there's not like this kind of ideology of the gold mountain that you would have later. That really, I mean, is a product of post 1848 the West Coast in the U.S. and the gold rush, and this idea that you can that migrating to the U.S. is and to the Americas is a way of actualizing some kind of social mobility, right? That doesn't really exist in the early modern period. Or I should say it exists to a very small extent because, rates of pay on the galleons are higher than what a lot of people could get as dock workers, for example, in the Philippines, or sailing in the Philippines. And so you have like some very localized forms of social mobility that are uniquely possible through the galleons and through ending up in the Americas, but it's not really a kind of dominant factor. But there is a kind of long-term legacy of these kind of channels of forced labor during the early modern period, because the means by which most Asians ended up in the Americas during the 19th century were similarly through a very coercive form of contract labor, which in many cases has been called a de facto form of enslavement, right? Especially if you look at what Chinese contract laborers are doing in places like Cuba, for example, where enslavement was still active when Chinese laborers are arriving. They're ending up on plantations and laboring side by side with enslaved Afro-Cubans as well. So there are kind of long-term legacies. In the book, I suggest that the factors that contributed to the kind of reduction of the Manila galleon trade simultaneously enabled these other trans-imperial circuits of exploitation and forced migration that produced these later waves during the 19th century. So,
yeah.
Yeah, so I'm Alex. I'm currently writing my thesis on Asian racialization and policy in the US. And I had two questions. So you mentioned how first Asians were these people who were ascribed this notion of Chino, which like you could probably equate to like what Asian is broadly today. So I was wondering when this first formal/informal description of it, like some sort of like top-down pressure, because I imagine these people when they came to the Americas did not they didn't see themselves as Chinos. They were people from a variety of different nations and different ethnicities. And then my second question was, when did this change? Because I have a very like US-centric understanding of Asian American history. And then when did this change to where Chinos or Asians started to identify with this label, whether it's for like as a political bloc or however?
Yeah, excellent questions about the Chino label, and this is a major focus of my research and my book, because it's a curiosity. There's no real single archival source that really adequately explains like why this happens, when it happens, and how people respond to it. So it really has to be kind of cobbled together from fragments spread across hundreds of different sources. It's a really meticulous process. But what I can say is that it begins haphazardly, because most of the people who get called Chino in Mexico had been called Indio in the Philippines. And this matters because, well, let me just say that, they're called Indio in the Philippines because if you're an inhabitant of any land, that could be anywhere in the world, that's claimed by the Spanish crown, then they were Indios, regardless of what continent, right? So this is why you have people in Asia being called Indios, and that having the same kind of legal designation as people who are called Indio in the Americas. And basically, for our purposes, that's very important because even though it rarely happened on the ground, the Indio ascription was supposed to protect indigenous people from enslavement, from inquisitorial denunciation, and other kinds of laws that apply to other groups of people, especially Afro-Mexicans, about which there are many laws that kind of limit the kind of social mobility that they're able to actualize. So when Asians cross the Pacific and start to get called Chino, and this is a process that, looking at treasury records in Acapulco of people arriving, it begins in the 1590s and is sort of haphazard. There's this kind of in-between category of Indio Chino to designate someone who is an Indio but from Asia, from someone who is called an Indio from the Americas. And then there's a shift in 1615, after which at the port, Asians are just called Chino. There's no kind of intermediary category anymore. You have a kind of negotiation that occurs outside of the port still for a while of categories, but Asians are just Chinos at Acapulco after 1615. So what that means is people who had previously had these at least formal protections under the Indio category in the Philippines no longer had those protections, right? They were, so that means that they can sort of be taken as enslaved people regardless of, quote unquote, legal justification for their enslavement. They can be denounced by the Inquisition. We have this, that's a sort of another subtext of what's happening in the case of Alonso Coronel, and why he's calling himself an Indio also is because he's not really supposed to be punished by the Inquisition if he's an Indio, but then they say he's a Chino, so then he can be, formally prosecuted. So anyway, there are all these kinds of legal valences going on in the use of this term. But you're absolutely right in your second question that, even though this kind of begins as a top-down thing, we have examples of people for whom their trans-Pacific displacement really mattered and how they thought about themselves. And you have certain trends begin to emerge among people who are called Chinos. And one of those trends is you have Asians, and remember, this is an enormously diverse group, begin to seek each other across ethno-linguistic lines for marriage at higher rates than among other groups. You also have Asians assigning each other as godparents, for example, for their children in ways that cross ethno-linguistic lines. And for example, during some of these marriage cases, you have to bring witnesses to your marriage. And, there are cases where the witness is brought, the person says, oh, I knew this person for several years in Manila. We crossed together on the same boat. And now we're still in touch in Mexico City, and we have been for the past 3 years or something like that. So you have these kinds of references to this trans-Pacific context that begins to matter at the level of social relations, who's marrying who, and the kind of creation of really, really mixed second and third generation descendants.
Thank you. I don't know if y'all can see, but there's a question in the Q&A as well from Michelle. Are, is Michelle able to unmute and ask it, or should we ask it?
I'll ask it. So the question is, would you say that the Asian Mexican community is thriving today?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's a bit outside of my frame of research, but I can still comment on it to a certain extent. So Asian communities in Mexico have gone through a lot during the modern period, since the Manila Galleon period. There's very little kind of consciousness about the descendants of the Manila Galleon period, although there are now DNA studies coming out that kind of show that the descendants of that movement are still around on the Pacific coast. Well, that kind of jury's out. It remains to be seen what kind of broader social or cultural impact those studies may have. But a lot of work has been done on Chinese Mexican communities, especially the kind of violence around and persecution of Chinese Mexicans around the period of the Mexican Revolution, and in particular, the massacre in 1911 of some 300 Chinese Mexicans in Torreon, Mexico, which was the largest massacre of any Asian people in the Americas. And there's been some really great work on looking at how the emergence of a Mexican mestizo identity, La Raza Cósmica, after the Mexican Revolution was really defined in opposition to the kind of specter of otherness that Chinese Mexicans represented within the national mindset ideology. But in recent years, there's been a kind of movement to recognize these sort of long-term discrimination against Chinese Mexicans. The extent to which it's lip service versus like actual redirecting of resources into communities is still something that's being actively negotiated. But at the very least, there is at the highest levels greater recognition of the subjectivity of Chinese Mexicans within the nation. So in terms of thriving, I mean, you have multiple kinds of waves of diasporic groups that are overlapping right now, like the descendants of Chinese Mexicans that have been there for a very long time, new migrants, often connected to overseas investments. So I think it kind of remains to be seen how all of that will be consolidated in the coming years, especially with the new administration. So.
Thank you. Anyone else in virtually or in El Centro?
I have a question. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I really enjoy your talk. And I was wondering, can you give examples of the Asian legacy, especially in colonial times? Because I haven't read that much about. I think I found a reference in Woman Poma de Ayala, but it was very short. So I was wondering if you could provide some examples of their legacy. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. You mean specifically the legacy, but within the colonial period, right? I guess that's okay. Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the real challenges of doing this work is most of the time the references are these little snippets from many sources. And you have people who are called Chinos showing up in colonial diaries, both in Mexico and in Mexico City and in Lima. You have references to the Trans-Pacific Galleon trade, even in indigenous Nahuatl writing by people like Chimalpahin. who were writing in the early 17th century. So those references exist, but the kind of greatest legacy is undoubtedly the life of Catarina de San Juan, sometimes called the China Poblana, although what the China Poblana became is quite different from the life of Catarina de San Juan, if any of you are sort of familiar with the story. But basically, Catarina was a woman from South Asia who was enslaved as a child and brought to Manila, traded across the Pacific, ended up in Puebla. Her enslavers end up passing away. She gains her freedom and lives most of her life, 6 decades of her life as a free person in Puebla, and gains renown, actually, as a kind of symbol of Catholic devotion and the successes of the overseas missionary enterprise, because she's seen as a devout Catholic in Puebla, and becomes this kind of folk saint and symbol of local pride. To the extent that the longest publications to come out in colonial Mexico are actually about her, which is really remarkable. And of course, there's a lot of myth making around her life, but I think she's a really great starting point for looking at the kind of colonial legacy of Asians in the Americas, and it's where I begin my book, actually, is with her. So that's to say, there are some very specific examples. The challenge is kind of oscillating between how much a particular example can tell us about the trend, because Catarina is really so exceptional. She's really quite different from the thousands of others who were crossing at that same time. So that's the kind of methodological challenge with using singular cases like her. But that's to say there is a colonial legacy. So yeah.
Anyone else from the El Centro? If not, I had a few questions, actually. One, how long did this project take you, and where did you end up going? And number two, how many languages do you need to know to go sift through all the documents?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I mean, the project began as my dissertation during grad school. Started working on it in 2015. So I mean, almost a decade from then till when the book came out, which I'm told is kind of on the quick side of things, but but in terms of archives, I went to Spain many times, Mexico, the Philippines, and then there are also archives in the US, like the John Carter Brown Library that I consulted. There are also materials in the Library of Congress, the Huntington, etc., the Benson collection. There are many archives in the US as well that have material pertaining to this. But I mean, most of the work was, as I've alluded to, is really trying to track down fragments. And what that means is, I have vivid memories of sitting in the archive in the Archivo General de Indias in Sevilla in Spain with these massive tomes of account books for Acapulco, and just paging through every year of every documented economic transaction that occurred at the port, which, as you can imagine, is thousands and thousands of pages, and just trying to mine it for any mention of people who, are the people that I'm looking for in my work. And, that kind of meticulous, in some ways soul-crushing work is familiar to anyone who has studied, marginalized populations, especially in the colonial world. And it's necessary to do this kind of work. In terms of language, most of this work was done in Spanish, and a little bit in Portuguese as well. I think there was actually one source in English There's a missionary named Thomas Gage that goes to colonial Mexico and kind of comments on people going to the Philippines. But other than that, everything was in Spanish. Like I mentioned, a few sources in Portuguese, and then a little bit, a little bit in Chinese as well. But my Mandarin's not good enough to do like serious archival work in that language, but I can get away with a little bit. So a lot of the work in Spanish Pacific studies is necessarily collaborative because the spread of languages that are needed to have true expertise in this field are many. And they're oftentimes not taught together in a singular program. So I think that kind of motions towards a kind of change that's needed in graduate training and undergraduate training in order to be able to really tap into the full potential of doing this kind of work.
Wow, thank you. There's a question in the Q&A, and it's Dr. Carola Haas says, really fascinating work. I'm curious if there's evidence of families working to maintain cultural histories and passing along language, food, or cultural traditions to future generations, or if little survive due to assimilation.
Yeah, so there is now there's a scholar that's working in this direction along the Pacific coast in Mexico. For example, and a lot of her work uncovers this, and there are a number of people kind of working in this direction in Mexico. So one of the major industries during the colonial period along the Pacific coast was the cultivation of coconut wine and coconut liquor and other kinds of products used made using coconut fibers. And the knowledge of how to do this came from people in the Philippines who did this already and sort of recreated similar kinds of beverages in Mexico. And this became a huge industry to the extent that, missionaries were complaining that everyone was drinking this coconut wine. No one was drinking, Spanish wine anymore, and this was a real problem. And that communion was being taken with this wine, and that's also a real sort of religious transgression. So anyway, the kind of methods for cultivating this, it's called tuba in the Philippines. This kind of beverage, and there are communities now in Mexico trying to recreate some of those traditions. But in terms of like an unbroken legacy, you don't really see that in terms of what survives today. But there is a growing kind of consciousness that this is still part of who Mexican people are on the Pacific coast. So.
Thank you. Are there any last questions at all? Beto?
No, no question.
No questions? Are we all good then? Oh, Gia.
Final one. I know throughout this process, you learned a lot about different peoples throughout the world, but what did you learn about yourself? This is a very long project.
Yeah, that's a great question. We could probably be here all evening talking about that, but but I guess what I can say, I can talk a little bit about the kind of family history connection that I have to some of this work. So part of my family is Chinese Cuban, and that was a real kind of motivation for thinking through for wanting to do a project that that dealt with Asia, Latin America connections, and especially thinking about such a project from the angle of lived experience and of the movement of people, because the history of the Manila Galleons is by and large, the realm of economic history, the silver for silk trade, the kind of creation of a global economy across the Pacific, and that those really weren't really the questions that I was interested in asking. So So, even though, my family history has, a late 19th century origin of migration from China to Cuba that doesn't go back to this early modern period, it was still a kind of point of entry for asking certain types of questions of the sources. So I came to think about the people I was studying as a kind of, there's an anthropologist named Lok Siu who writes about the process of diasporic affect and how sharing a similar kind of trajectory can be a point of entry to doing academic work. And so I came to think of what I was doing in those terms, because I kind of thought of this early modern movement as having a kind of diasporic ancestry for Asian Latin Americans, as a kind of an origin point, as I mentioned in the talk. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Spurred one last question. What's your next project?
Oh, I have multiple next projects. But I guess what I can mention quickly is a brief plug for a podcast that I've been working on for the past couple of years. That's coming out at the end of this month. It's called The Historian's Table, being done with Julian Saporiti of No No Boy, along with the podcast creator of Those Who Can't Teach Anymore, which is an award-winning podcast. Both of them know much more about podcasts than I do. But the season is about kind of the personal connection to this history specifically, focusing on my work and how I guess the lived experiences of a historian can inform how they approach their historical topic. So that's sort of in the near term. The longer term, book length projects, I'm working on a couple of things. One is a history of what I'm calling the early modern Black Pacific. So looking at the two nodes of trans-Pacific trade, both Manila and Acapulco, as being very understudied sites that had visible and socially mobile Black populations during the same period. And then another project I'm being drawn towards is about the spread of early modern fencing ideas in the Americas and to the Philippines, and as kind of an ideology of empire that gets negotiated from the ground up in all of these places as well. And it's also a way of perceiving ethnographically other people that Spaniards run into in the colonial world. So yeah, so those are two projects I've got going on right now.
Wow, I'm looking forward to listening to their podcast. There is actually one more question from El Centro, and then we'll close. Beto?
So I have another question about the kind of mechanisms of social mobility that Latin Asian Americans eventually found themselves using to kind of work their way into the middle class, or even like to the elite level of society.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of what I look at are licenses to that people called chinos apply for, that to differentiate themselves from the kind of massive chinos, which are thought of as like unruly and part of like the urban poor. And what these licenses allow chinos to do is carry weapons, to trade at goods in various places, to practice certain trades like cutting hair, and a variety of other things. And so you have this kind of class of people who are awarded licenses to do these things, but at the same time, they're constantly having to prove that they have these licenses and that they're sort of officially designated as exceptions, really. and because they're constantly sort of being harassed by low-ranking magistrates and functionaries who are asking for their licenses and sometimes, disregarding the license and tearing up their licenses and all of this. So, so that kind of mimics an argument by a historian named Robert Douglas Cope, who argued that, social mobility was possible for people who were in the sistema de castas, the caste system, but it got more difficult the higher they rose. And, you could see a parallel in Homi Bhabha's writing about colonial mimicry, for example. And the other form through which you see social mobility predominantly is through military service. So you have, a lot of people from the Philippines, for example, who are fighting in the Spanish colonial armies, and they use that record of service to apply for various things. And there are a couple of people who even become encomenderos, and who, which means that they can receive tribute from indigenous populations, which means that they've become part of the colonial elite, really. So you have a few rare cases like that. And of enslavers as well, Asians who become enslavers. This is a marker of wealth, of generational wealth, really, in colonial society. So there are examples of that as well. But yeah, so there are a few mechanisms like that through which social mobility was possible.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Round of applause.
Thank you all so much. Really great questions, and I'm honored again to have been invited to speak with you all.
We really appreciate it. Hopefully one day maybe we'll bring you in person.
Sure, I'd love to.
Yeah, but thank you again for a fascinating talk, and I love the Q&A as well, and looking forward to all the things in the future.
Yeah, yeah.
Appreciate it. Have a good evening, everybody.
All right, thank you, and stay safe and healthy out there.